The tail number was N604KA, and the man holding it up to the morning light was not, by any measure the cameras understood, someone who mattered. Why would a single $50 bolt be worth grounding a fleet insured for $400 million, and why does the man holding it refuse to explain himself? He wore a navy coverall gone soft at the knees, a patch stitched crooked over the left pocket that read Winthrop Aerostructures in letters half cracked from age, and he stood at the base of the jet's boarding stairs with a bolt no bigger than his thumb pinched between two fingers, turning it slowly, as if listening for something inside it. Behind him, 40 feet of white fuselage caught the sun and threw it back twice as hard. In front of him stood Meredith Kingsley, green pen already uncapped, 3 photographers, 2 junior partners from a logistics conglomerate she was folding into her empire that morning, and a folding table with a leather binder open to a signature line that said, "Final Airworthiness Release, Captain and Maintenance Authority." Stay with this one to the end. The bolt is never the real story. "Mr. Rhodes," Kingsley did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. "I have a partnership signing in 9 minutes, and a fleet that has flown 400,000 miles this year without incident. Sign the release." "This bolt doesn't match the certified fastener spec for this airframe," Emmett said. He held it up higher, close enough that she could have taken it from his hand if she'd wanted to look. She didn't. "I can't verify the wing attachment fitting is load rated until I know what's actually holding it. It's a $50 part. It's the only part between your left wing and the ground, Miss Kingsley." A photographer's shutter clicked twice, embarrassed by its own timing. One of the junior partners laughed the short laugh people use when they aren't sure whether laughing is safe. Kingsley's face did not change, which was somehow worse than if it had. "You're done," she said. "Get your tools. Someone competent will finish this." She said it the way she signed things, without lifting her eyes twice to check the words. Emmett did not argue. He did not raise his voice, did not look for allies among the technicians clustered near the tug, did not so much as glance at the folding table where another young mechanic, pale under the attention, was already reaching for the green pen she held out to him. He simply walked to the maintenance shack, filled out a single form in block letters, stamped it with a certification number that had not lapsed in 11 years, and filed a formal airworthiness hold against all 6 tail numbers registered to Kingsley Atlas Holdings before the coffee in the break room had gone cold. It was not a request. It was not a suggestion filed for someone else's convenience. Under federal aviation regulation, an airworthiness hold, issued by a certificated inspector, grounds an aircraft the instant it is filed, and no owner, no chief pilot, and no billionaire with a green pen and 9 minutes to a signing ceremony can override it by signature, by threat, or by wish. By the time Meredith Kingsley's assistant found the paperwork wedged in the tower's fax queue, all 6 of her jets sat parked on Aldington Air's ramp, under a hold that would take a federal inspector to lift, and the man who filed it had already clocked out, already collected his lunch cooler from the break room refrigerator, and already begun the 22-minute drive home to a house with a crayon drawing taped inside the toolbox lid and a 9-year-old waiting for the version of her father who never once, in 4 years, forgot to pick her up on time. 3 weeks earlier, before any of it, the morning had started the way it always started, at 5:40, in the dark, with the particular quiet of a house where only 2 people breathe. Emmett cracked 2 eggs into a pan on low heat and set a second pan beside it for oatmeal, because Opal would only eat one or the other, depending on some private calculus of her own that changed with the seasons, and that he had long since stopped trying to predict. He packed her lunch in the blue container she'd chosen herself at the start of the school year, the one with the cloud sticker on the lid, half peeled now, that she'd be quietly furious to find missing. 2 carrot sticks. A folded paper towel instead of a napkin, because they'd run out of napkins on Tuesday and neither of them had thought to buy more. "You're doing the thing," Opal said from the kitchen table, not looking up from the cereal box she was reading for the 4th morning in a row. "What thing?" "The tapping thing. On the counter." She held up 3 fingers and tapped them twice against the table, an unconscious echo of a gesture that was not, strictly, hers to have learned. Emmett had never taught it to her. Louise used to do it exactly that way, twice and stop, when she was thinking through a load calculation at this same counter, back when there had been 3 people in this house instead of 2, back when Opal was young enough that the habit must have entered her the way water enters wood, without either of them noticing until it had already set. He didn't correct her, he never did. He knelt instead and retied her left shoe, which had come loose twice already this week, despite being tied correctly both times, and said nothing about that either. "Are the jets today the shiny ones?" she asked, swinging her legs. "Some of them. Do you like the shiny ones or the old ones better?" "The old ones tell you the truth faster," he said, and she nodded like this was a perfectly reasonable answer, because to her, it was. He drove her the 11 blocks to Kessler Elementary with the radio off, the way he always did, and watched her walk in through the side door without looking back, the way she always did, and did not allow himself to watch a moment longer than that before pulling back into traffic, because there was a shift to make and a fleet on the ramp that did not care, this morning or any morning, whose child he'd just kissed goodbye. At Aldington, nobody would have called Emmett Rhodes remarkable. He was a contract line technician, one of 11 on the day roster, paid by the hour to torque fasteners and inspect landing gear and sign off routine checks that senior staff considered beneath their attention. His file listed no degree, no prior employer beyond a decade of scattered small shop work, and a start date 4 years old, which was, not coincidentally, exactly as long as Opal had been without her mother. He had asked for the modest jobs. He had never once, in 4 years, applied for anything larger. Lawrence Beaumont, chief of maintenance engineering, knew him mostly as a name on a timesheet and a man who was, if he was honest, unnervingly quiet for someone who spent his days around machines loud enough to deafen the unprotected ear. Thorough, Beaumont had written once in a performance note, if slow. He had not meant it as praise. So when Kingsley Atlas Holdings scheduled the signing ceremony for its new 12-city charter partnership on Aldington's own ramp, 6 jets lined in a gleaming row, press credentials issued, champagne on ice in a cooler that cost more than Emmett's truck, nobody thought to ask why the assigned sign-off inspector for tail number 604 Kilo Alpha was a man in a coverall with someone else's company patch still sewn over his heart. Meredith Kingsley arrived at 9 sharp in a coat the color of a closed door, green pen already in her jacket pocket, flanked by 2 junior partners from the logistics firm she was folding into her holdings that quarter, and a photographer she'd hired herself to make sure the version of the morning that survived was the one she wanted. She initialed things. She always initialed things. In green, on every sign-off sheet that touched her fleet, because, she had said once, to a magazine, and meant it, a signature in black ink could belong to anyone. She did not know Emmett's name until he said, quite calmly, that he could not put his stamp on the release. "There's a bolt in the left wing root fitting," he said, "that doesn't match the certified fastener list for this airframe. I pulled the panel to check the torque stripe and found a part number that isn't in any vendor catalog Aldington has on file." "How long have you worked here?" Kingsley asked, not unkindly, the way one asks a stranger for directions one doesn't expect to need. 4 years. "And how many jets like this one have you inspected in that time?" "This will be my first." She almost smiled. Not cruelly, she would have said, if asked, that she wasn't capable of cruelty, only clarity, but with the particular ease of someone confirming what she'd already decided. "This is overcaution," she said, loud enough for the row of photographers to catch it clean, from a man who checks tire pressure for a living. "I have a partnership to sign. Someone competent will finish this." Somebody near the tug laughed, not loud but audible, the kind of laugh that costs nothing and means everything to the person it's aimed near. A young technician named Dale, barely 2 years into his certification, was already stepping forward when Kingsley crooked 2 fingers at him and held out the green pen like a baton being passed. He took it. His hand, Emmett noticed, was not quite steady. The photographers applauded the exchange the way people applaud things they don't understand but recognize as a resolution, a problem solved in real time for the cameras. Emmett did not move from beside the aircraft. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't appeal to Beaumont. standing off to the side with his arms crossed and his jaw tight in a way that suggested he already half believed the flagged bolt was nothing, a technician's nerves, before an audience too large for him. Emmett simply stood at the base of the stairs, the bolt still between two fingers, and said, to no one in particular and everyone at once, I'm not signing this release, and I'd advise nobody else does either, until someone can tell me where this part came from. You're done, Kingsley said again, and this time it carried all the way to the tail of the aircraft. Security will walk you out. He let them. He did not resist, did not raise his hands, did not say another word in his own defense, because he had already decided, somewhere in the 10 seconds between the laugh and the pen-changing hands, that his defense would not be spoken. It would be filed. Curtis Kessler found him an hour later at the fence line behind the maintenance hangar, still in his coverall, the visitor badge already stripped from his collar and folded once in his shirt pocket like something he intended to keep. You get anywhere near that hold paperwork, Curtis said, not a question. Already filed. Curtis nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a suspicion of 14 years finally has somewhere to land. Then you'd better come back inside, he said, because in about 10 minutes, somebody in that office is going to realize she can't unsign what she already can't sign, and I want to be standing next to you when they figure out why. Nobody stopped Curtis when he walked Emmett back through the gate. That was the first thing Lawrence Beaumont noticed, that the line chief, 14 years at this company, a man who did not vouch for people lightly, had simply put a hand on the fired technician's shoulder and said, he's with me, and the guard at the gate, who answered to Curtis on every ramp decision that didn't involve a signature, let them both through without a second glance. The second thing Beaumont noticed, an hour into the grounding, was that Emmett didn't seem interested in defending himself at all. He moved instead toward the second aircraft in the row, tail number 605 Kilo Alpha, and ran two fingers slowly along the wing root, faring the way another man might run a hand along a piano, before deciding whether to sit down and play it. You don't work here anymore, Beaumont said. It came out flatter than he intended. I know. Then what are you doing? Listening, Emmett said, and did not explain further, which Beaumont would later admit was the single most unsettling answer he'd received in 11 years of managing technicians who explained everything, usually at too much length, usually to cover for something they hadn't actually checked. A hydraulic test rig kicked on somewhere down the row, and its whine climbed through two registers before settling into a steady drone that most people in the hangar had long since trained themselves not to hear. Emmett tilted his head very slightly, as if the sound had said something to him that the pitch alone carried. He waited for it to cycle down, then popped the same access panel he'd have had no legal authority to touch an hour earlier, and Curtis, badge still valid, authority still intact, reached in ahead of him and pulled it the rest of the way, so that nothing that happened next could be called trespass. The bolt in 605's wing root carried the same stamp as the one in 604. Not similar, the same, a part number with no listed vendor, machined to a shear tolerance that looked correct to an untrained eye and wrong to Emmett's in a way he didn't yet have language for beyond the sense, familiar and unwelcome, of a tool that has been asked to do a job it was never built for. He wrote the number down in a small notebook he'd produced from his coverall pocket, the kind sold in packs of 3 at any hardware counter, and moved to the third aircraft without being asked, and without asking permission, and Beaumont, who by then had stopped crossing his arms and started, instead, watching Emmett's hands the way a man watches a hand of cards he suspects he's already lost, said nothing to stop him. Same bolt, Curtis said quietly, when the third panel came off, and the same stamp caught the hangar light. It wasn't a question either. He said it the way a man says a diagnosis he has privately carried for a long time, and only now has cause to speak aloud. Same bolt, Emmett agreed. Beaumont looked at the two of them, the fired contractor and the line chief who by rights should have escorted him off the property an hour ago, and felt, for the first time that day, the particular chill of a man realizing he does not understand a room he is technically in charge of. How many more of these are there? He asked. 6 tail numbers, Emmett said. I'd want to check all 6 before I told you a number that means anything. You don't work here, Beaumont said again, quieter this time, less a rebuke than an admission that the sentence no longer carried the weight it had an hour earlier. No, Emmett agreed, but the hold does. He asked, finally, for a dial gauge, the kind used to measure the minute deflection in a fastener under controlled load, a tool most line technicians touch twice a year if that. And when Beaumont produced one from the tool crib without argument, Emmett clamped it to the bolt from 605 Kilo Alpha, seated it in a bench vise, and began, with the unhurried precision of a man reading a letter he'd been expecting for a long time, to apply torque in small measured increments and watch the needle. At 42 foot-pounds, well under the rated capacity for a certified fastener of this class, the needle jumped, not failed, jumped, a small stutter in the deflection curve that any properly heat-treated bolt should never show. That shouldn't move like that, Beaumont said, leaning in despite himself. It's fatiguing under thermal cycling, Emmett said. Every takeoff and landing runs this fitting through a temperature swing it was never rated for, if the bolt is what I think it is, instead of what it should be. It's not the load it can't handle, it's the swing. He set the gauge down and looked at neither of them in particular. There's a test protocol for exactly this, thermal cycling fatigue against a torque retention curve. I know it works because I wrote it. The hangar, which had not been fully silent since the morning shift began, went silent. 14 years ago, Curtis said, into that silence, in the plain voice of a man who has waited a long time to say a true thing out loud. This man was the lead fastening engineer at Winthrop Aerostructures. He wrote the original certified bolt specification for the airframe class that became this fleet. I worked under him for 6 years before Winthrop got folded into a merger and his whole division got dissolved on a Friday afternoon with no announcement and no name kept on anything he'd built. He looked at Beaumont, not unkindly, the way one colleague corrects another over something that matters more than pride. You've been standing next to the man who wrote the rule your vendor's been breaking. Beaumont didn't ask if it was true. Something in the way Emmett had gone back to the gauge, unhurried, uninterested in the effect of the sentence just spoken about him, told Beaumont everything Curtis's claim required for corroboration. He looked instead at the notebook in Emmett's hand, at the 3 matching part numbers written in a column, at the fired technician recalibrating the gauge for a 4th reading nobody had asked him to take, and felt the specific vertigo of a man discovering that the least remarkable person in the building had, this entire time, been the only one qualified to say what was wrong with it. There's a 4th aircraft, Emmett said, not looking up. I'd like to check it before lunch. Nobody told him no. News of a fleet-wide airworthiness hold on 6 aircraft belonging to Kingsley Atlas Holdings reached the company's insurance underwriter by the following morning. Not through any announcement Meredith Kingsley made, but through the standard reporting channel, every certificated hold triggers automatically, a fact she would later admit she had never once, in 9 years of owning aircraft, bothered to learn existed. The underwriter's letter arrived within 36 hours, addressed jointly to Kingsley Atlas Holdings and Aldington Air, and it did not waste language. An emergency review board would convene in 11 days to assess whether coverage on all 6 tail numbers should be suspended pending independent structural audit. Should the review find the grounding justified and the underlying cause unresolved, the letter noted, coverage on the entire fleet, not merely the grounded aircraft, but every asset insured under the same corporate policy, including 2 aircraft not yet delivered, would be voided at the policy's next renewal date, a date that fell 9 days after the review itself. 11 days, that was the whole of it. 11 days to explain a bolt or lose the ability to fly anything at all. Lawrence Beaumont, to his credit, did not wait to be told what to do next. He requested the full procurement history for fastener purchases against the Kingsley Atlas maintenance contract, going back 3 years, expecting an afternoon's work and a clean paper trail that would let him tell the underwriter this was an isolated vendor error, contained, resolved, embarrassing but survivable. What came back instead, 4 hours later, from Aldington's own records department, was a file with an 11-month gap in it. Purchase orders, vendor invoices, compliance sign-offs, all present for the 2 years before the gap and the 7 months after it, and simply absent for the 11 months in between, as if that stretch of the company's own history had been quietly lifted out and the seam sewn shut behind it. "That's not a lost file," Beaumont said, standing in the doorway of the records office with the printout still warm from the machine. "Someone pulled that. Pulled it when?" The records clerk asked, and Beaumont realized with the particular discomfort of a question he should have already had answered, that he didn't know, and that the access log that would have told him, the one keyed to every account with clearance to modify procurement records, showed no entry for the deletion at all. Whoever had done it had access broad enough to touch the file, and also, somehow, to touch the log of who had touched it. He called Emmett that evening, which surprised them both. "I need someone who knows how these vendor numbers are structured," Beaumont said, without preamble, without apology for the tone he'd used on the tarmac 2 days earlier, which Emmett noted and did not mention. "The part number on your bolts. It's not a Winthrop-era number. It's newer. Whoever supplied it did it after you left." "How much newer?" "I don't know yet. That's the 11 months I can't see." There was a pause on the line, long enough that Beaumont almost asked if the call had dropped. "I can read a part number cold," Emmett said finally. "Bring me what you have, and bring Curtis. He's been here longer than the gap." Curtis Kessler, it turned out, kept his own records, not out of suspicion, he was careful to clarify, but out of the plain habit of a man who had watched 2 companies' worth of paperwork disappear in his career and had decided, privately, years ago, never again to trust a system to remember what he could write down himself. In a shoebox in his garage, alongside 14 years of hangar logs nobody had ever asked to see, was a handwritten vendor list current as of the exact month the digital gap began. The number matched a supplier neither Beaumont nor the current procurement department had ever formally listed, Holloway Fastener Supply, a discount aerospace parts distributor operating out of a facility 2 counties over, one that had never appeared on Aldington's approved vendor registry and yet had, according to Curtis's handwritten ledger, been shipping fasteners to the hangar under a purchase code that routed through petty cash rather than the standard procurement pipeline, a code low enough in dollar value, item by item, that it never triggered the compliance review larger purchases required. $50 a bolt, Emmett said, turning the ledger page toward the light. Never enough, on its own, to raise a flag. Just enough, times a fleet, times 18 months, to matter. 18 months. The number sat in the room like a held breath. Beaumont pulled the corporate ownership registry the following morning, a public filing he could have checked years earlier and never had reason to, and found what Curtis's ledger had only implied. Holloway Fastener Supply was 51% owned by a holding entity registered under the name B. Winthrop Ventures LLC, and Blythe Winthrop was, and had been for 6 years, Aldington Air's vice president of procurement. He sat with that fact for a full minute before he said anything to anyone, because the shape of it, once seen, could not be unseen. The woman who had authorized the vendor switch 18 months ago, who had signed off on every compliance log covering the gap, who had access broad enough to delete a procurement record and its own audit trail in the same afternoon, held a financial stake in the very company whose margin she'd been protecting. She cut costs, Beaumont said aloud, to no one, in an empty office. She cut costs and told the board it was efficiency, and she never told anyone whose pocket the difference went into. It took Emmett and Curtis 2 more days to build the rest of it, working evenings in Curtis's garage with the shoebox ledger and a laptop borrowed from Beaumont's own office, because Beaumont, humbled now in a way that no longer had room for pride about who had found what, had told them plainly to take whatever they needed. The purchase orders, once traced past the gap, showed a clean substitution. Certified Winthrop specification bolts, priced at just under $200 each, through the properly vetted aerospace vendor, replaced fleet-wide with Holloway's $47 equivalent, visually near identical, stamped with a part number Holloway had apparently invented rather than certified and never once tested under the thermal cycling protocol Emmett had authored 14 years earlier, a protocol that had, in fact, been quietly dropped from Aldington's own compliance checklist the same month the vendor switch began. Blythe Winthrop had not merely swapped a supplier, she had removed the one test that would have caught her doing it. Beaumont brought the full file to Meredith Kingsley himself 2 days before the review board convened, and did not wait for anyone to ask him to. He laid it on her desk in the order Emmett and Curtis had built it: the ledger, the ownership filing, the deleted compliance checklist item, the 18 months of margin, quietly diverted into a holding company with her VP of Procurement's name on it, and said only, "I should have caught this. I didn't, because I trusted a title instead of a record. The man I let you fire is the reason we caught it at all." The review board convened on a Thursday morning in a conference room on the 7th floor of the underwriter's downtown office, glass-walled, overlooking a runway Emmett could see from where he sat, but had not been asked to inspect. 11 days, to the hour, from the morning he'd held up a bolt on a tarmac and been walked off the property for it. He laid the evidence out in the order it had actually happened, not the order that would have flattered him. The dial gauge readings from 3 aircraft. The 14-year-old thermal cycling protocol, retrieved from an archived Winthrop technical library that had, against all odds, survived the merger that dissolved everything else. Curtis Kessler's handwritten ledger, entered into the record as a supporting exhibit. The corporate ownership filing connecting Halloway Fastener Supply to Blythe Winthrop, who had resigned by fax 2 days earlier and was not present in the room. He did not raise his voice at any point. He did not look at Meredith Kingsley when he described the morning she'd fired him, and he did not need to, because everyone else in the room was looking at her instead. "The specification I'm citing," he said, near the end, sliding a single laminated page across the table toward the board's lead auditor, "was written in 2011, for this airframe class, under my name. It was never formally withdrawn. It was simply stopped being followed." He paused, and it was the only pause in the entire presentation that felt, to those watching, like it cost him something. The bolt itself isn't the failure. The failure is that somebody decided the specification could be quietly ignored, and nobody in a position to notice ever asked why. Meredith Kingsley had read that specification the night before, in full, twice, at her kitchen table at 11 o'clock with a glass of water going warm beside her, after her assistant had pulled it from the same archive Emmett had cited and forwarded it without comment. She had seen her own fleet's tail numbers in the annotated diagrams, drawn by a hand she now recognized. She had seen, dated in the margin, a revision note in the same handwriting. Torque retention curve confirmed under 40 cycles. Do not substitute grade without retest. 11 years old, never violated until 18 months ago. Never once, in 9 years of ownership, had she asked who had written the rules her aircraft were built to. She stood before the board, finished its questions, which was itself a break in procedure nobody moved to stop. "Mr. Rhodes," her voice, for the first time since the tarmac, did not carry the ease of a woman who already knew how the room would end. "I fired you in front of cameras for doing the only correct thing anyone did that morning. I called it overcaution. It was the opposite of that. I own 6 aircraft, and I could not have told you, before this week, the name of a single person responsible for whether they were safe to fly. I'm telling the board that now because it's true, and because you never asked me to say it, which is, I understand, exactly the kind of thing you would never ask for." Nobody in the room applauded. It was not that kind of silence. "I'd like to offer you a permanent position," she went on. "Director of Structural Engineering, full authority over fleet compliance, and a signing bonus I think you'll find substantial." She named a figure. It was, by any reasonable measure, a great deal of money, enough to end the 11 blocks to Kessler Elementary and the tight math of a single income and a school-subsidized aftercare program that closed at 5:30 sharp. Emmett was quiet long enough that the board's lead auditor glanced up from her notes. "I don't want the bonus," he said finally. "I'll take the audit oversight, part-time, if Aldington keeps me on the floor the rest of the week, because that's where I do my best work, and I've no interest in an office." He set the laminated specification page back on the table, squaring its corner to the table's edge out of a habit neither Kingsley nor the board understood yet. What I'd ask instead is that the company fund an open safety audit program, unpaid, voluntary, available to any technician on the floor, regardless of title, so that the next person who sees something wrong doesn't have to write a federal hold just to be heard first. That's it, Kingsley said. That's the whole ask. My wife used to say, the math doesn't care who signs it, Emmett said. She was a structural engineer too, before she got sick. She meant that a bolt fails or it doesn't, whether the person who flags it has a title or a coverall. I'd like this company to build something that remembers that after I'm not the one saying it out loud. 3 months later, Blythe Winthrop's resignation had long since stopped being news anywhere but inside Aldington Air's own walls, and the Halloway Fastener Supply contract existed only as a line item in a settlement filing that Beaumont kept, for reasons he couldn't entirely explain even to himself, in the top drawer of his desk, rather than the archive where it belonged. The open audit program Emmett had asked for carried no name on its charter but his signature on its first protocol document, and 11 technicians across the hangar floor, including 2 who had laughed at him on the tarmac that morning without ever quite meeting his eyes since, had already filed reports under it that a supervisor's schedule would once have buried. Emmett still worked the line most days. He'd taken the audit hours the way he took most things, quietly, on his own terms, 2 afternoons a week that fit around Opal's school schedule rather than around anyone's convenience but hers. And Curtis Kessler still walked the ramp beside him some mornings, saying less than he used to, because there was less left that needed saying. On a Tuesday at the end of that spring, before the sun had fully cleared the fence line behind their house, Emmett knelt on the concrete floor of his garage with a small steel tin open on the workbench in front of him, the one that had once held Louise's hairpins. Dented at one corner from a move they'd made together 9 years ago, repurposed now for the one object he'd asked to keep from the entire 11-day ordeal, the original bolt from 604 Kilo Alpha, retired, tagged, its part number long since struck from every registry that had ever pretended it belonged there. Opal sat on the step beside him in her school clothes, working a stubborn knot out of her left shoelace with the particular frown she wore for problems she intended to solve herself before accepting help. "Are the new jets going to be safe now?" she asked, not looking up, tying the bow the way he'd shown her, twice around and through. He closed the tin over the bolt and set it back on the shelf where it had sat for 3 months now, beside a coffee can of loose washers and a photograph of a woman with the same steady eyes their daughter had inherited without ever having been taught to use them. "Yes," Emmett said, "because I checked. If you believe competence should outlast the title that gets stripped from it, you already understand what Emmett Rhodes never had to say out loud."